The night a retired pastor was taken from his ordinary life by the pale light of the parking lot and a presence that did not walk like a human would be the night everything Paul Mitchell had believed was pressed into a new shape. He was 63, a man whose hands still smelled faintly of old hymnals and lemon oil from polishing pews. For 35 years, those hands had lifted bread and cup, had laid a gentle pressure on trembling shoulders, had closed over trembling hands in funeral parlors and at hospital bedsides. He carried a pastor's posture even when he tried to shed it, a slow, attentive way of listening, an instinct to name suffering and to point toward Scripture. Yet those same hands had been emptied because grief had a way of unclasping everything Paul thought solid. Martha had been the gravity in his orbit. For decades, she was the small, fierce logic that kept his pulpit from becoming a lonely stage. She could still the flurried questions with a look. When she laughed, the stained glass seemed to warm. When she died, the church's windows grew cold, as if a season had shifted and no one had told the light. Her last days were a blur of oxygen lines and beeping monitors, and the last words that burned into Paul's memory were neither a prayer of surrender nor a promise of peace, but a frightened whisper. What happens to us, Paul? Where do we go if the light isn't there? He had held her and prayed the words he had always offered, but in the quiet after, he kept hearing that one small, terrified question. It gnawed. The congregation bristled with comforting phrases, but comfort is a different thing from certainty, and in the months after Martha's funeral, certainty was the one commodity Paul could not find. Sermons began to feel like rehearsals of words he no longer trusted. He loved his people. He loved theology. Yet every time he told the story of salvation as if it were a map to a place someone else had already surveyed, the inside of him felt like an unlit road. He kept showing up, Sunday after Sunday, because habit and duty were anchors. But during the week he prowled the sanctuary like a man trying doors, hoping to find a back room that still held an answer. The church at night was a strange, honest place. The fluorescent sign on the corner threw square light over the lawn, and the steeple shadow was a large, watchful thing on the pavement. Paul would sit in the third pew from the back and fold his hands over the pew in front of him, not for ceremony but for contact, the contact of wood beneath his palms, the recency of the creak underfoot, anything to remind him he belonged somewhere. He prayed with the language of a lifetime and the quiet of someone whose prayers had become smaller over time. Words for consolation, for those who grieve, for strength to continue. But prayer had become a strange liturgy of petitions that received no audible answer.
It was not that he felt abandoned so much as that the shape of God's voice, if there ever was an audible one, had shrunk away. On a late January evening, the cold had a sharpness that made the air feel like glass. The parking lot was an island of light and wet asphalt, the church building a low silhouette against a black, starless sky. He had locked up after an evening Bible study, a small group that had dwindled with the years, and the heater in his car was as exhausted as he felt. The church sign's letters flickered in the wind. He paused at the driver's side, turning the key in his hand as if the metal might take on the warmth he lacked. His breath came in white clocks. A figure stood near the edge of the lot, under the half-lit glow of an old lamp. At first, Paul assumed it was a neighbor or one of the youth volunteers who had forgotten their keys. The shape was too still to be human at rest. The winter jacket hung without the small betrayals of movement. The head did not bob when a car passed in the distance. Something about the posture looked like a sculpture someone had left there and forgotten. He squinted. If he should have been afraid, he did not register it yet. Instead, the old instinct to reach out and welcome wore the same muscle as the instinct to preach, rose without permission. "Are you all right?" he called, his voice unusually loud in the hollow of the lot. There was no reply in sound. The figure tilted its head as if it had never learned to respond with the atmosphere of ordinary speech. Then, as if an echo that did not belong to the night, a voice gathered inside his skull. Paul Mitchell. It was not a voice you could point to in the air. It had the clarity of somebody saying your name at a distance, but simultaneously it felt as if the syllables were being traced on the back of his mind. Paul froze. His first adult thought was that someone had played a cruel trick. His second thought,
which came faster than he could scold himself for ridiculousness, was that the night was playing tricks. But the name was exact. The cadences of the spoken letters trembled like a bell. "Who?" he began, and the question thinned. The voice had the calm precision of a teacher who opens a page and points to a single line. "Do not be afraid," it said. "We come in invitation." It would have been too simple and perhaps too unspooky to call it a voice. It was a transmission. Paul could not tell whether his mouth had formed the words or whether the sound had always been there within him, waiting for permission. A rational man reaches for rational anchors in moments like this. The mind catalogues possibilities. Sleep deprivation, a trick of light, a prankster, delirium. But the name had the weight of his baptismal certificate. The tone of familiarity moved past coincidence. The figure under the lamp did not move toward him in the way people step closer.
Instead, it seemed to live a fraction of a second out of phase with the world, as if gravity had softened around it. The fluorescent halo made the edges of its form too bright to see clearly. When it stepped into the pool of the church door's recessed light, Paul saw that it wore no clothing he could name. The surface of the being's torso caught the light like a river does the sun. It had the suggestion of limbs, but the joints did not resolve into the familiar mechanics of a human body. Paul would later spend hours trying to pin down the sight in words, a silhouette that was both too tall and too thin, a head that seemed almost too large for a human skull. There was no grotesque mask or metallic menace. There was attention. It regarded him, not with the blunt curiosity of an animal, but with the careful focus of an exam that does not hurry. When it spoke again, the transmission was no longer merely a name. A phrase unfurled in his mind like a ribbon. "We would like to show you." There was a tenderness in the cadence, as if the offer were domestic and sacred all at once. Paul could have fled. He knew the reasonable lines he could follow. Drive home, call his daughter, go to the pastoral emergency hotline. But the night had the argument of exhaustion behind it, and Martha's last question sat like a pebble in his throat. He had prayed for answers and not received them. Here something presented an answer with the gentleness of a hand on his shoulder. "Why me?" he thought aloud, meaning the question to be spoken. The answer came without the formalities of explanation. "We watch those who ask." He felt the word watch as if a warm hand moved across the back of his head. Watching was not surveillance. In this voice it meant attention, sustained, tender, precise. A memory of standing at a hospital bed hours after Martha's breath had stilled and feeling like he had been under a microscope returned to him. People watched him then, with sorrow, with curiosity. Now whatever was before him used the same verb, but there was no pity in its tone, only purpose. He stepped forward, not because he had decided bravely, but because his legs had the strange obedience to old disciplines. The door of the church opened as he approached. It yielded soundlessly, and inside the sanctuary the air felt different. The faint musk of old wood and candle wax, the residual warmth of evening lights, the subtle hum of the heater, all those familiar senses rearranged under a layer of attention. Once inside, the being did something that would later be described by Paul as unwinding the dark. It placed within his mind an image, like someone sliding open a window. Paul saw Martha at the foot of the bed in the hospice ward, not as a photograph, but as a presence whose edges were more reflective than solid.
Her fear was there, but beneath it, something else moved. A delicate thread of light slipped from her chest, as if a small lamp had been turned on within her and was too feeble to banish the room's shadow. Paul choked on the memory. He could smell the antiseptic, feel the thin blanket against her skin. The being did not narrate. It simply placed the scene where Paul could see it, and the effect was worse than explanation. He felt complicit, as if the time he had not been present in the right way was now cast back across him in guilt. "You mourn," the voice said. The words were not unkind. "You have knelt at the bedside, and the question that came from the room continues to haunt you." Paul thought of the question, where do we go if the light isn't there? He had believed that salvation was a promise as much as an address, a code that unlocked a future grave for the faithful, a doctrine that made sense of grief. The being's showing of Martha did not mock that belief. Instead, it slid beside the belief and suggested an addendum, like someone pointing to another page in a book the pastor had been reading his whole life. He tried to maintain the outer composure of a man trained to lead prayer, even while his inner posture was scrambling for footing. "Who are you?" he asked out loud, though his throat felt as if it had been hollowed. The being did something like a laugh, but it was not scornful. The sound existed in the valley between thought and sense,
a small ripple across an otherwise still pond. Names matter in your language, Paul Mitchell. You have many. To your kind, we are observers. To some, we will be your teachers. To others, merely a question. This was the first time an explicit foreignness entered the frame, the word observers. It suggested distance and study. Paul thought of astronomers bent over scopes, of the way humans look outward to make sense of themselves. If this intelligence came from the stars, the being did not offer credentials. What it offered were perceptions, glimpses, not proofs. Paul's training insisted that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. The being seemed to understand that rule and answered with images. From the pulpit, the church's crucifix cast a shadow that shivered on the wooden floorboards. Paul fixated on the image of the cross like one clutches a raft. Everything he had learned, everything he had preached about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the whole scaffolding that had carried his sermons week to week, stood before him as both anchor and temptation. If this thing in the sanctuary began to reinterpret Jesus, Paul feared he might be forced into either cowardice or a betrayal he could not trust. The being extended no hand. Instead, light gathered at its core and then fell into a scatter of luminous motes that drifted over the hymnals like snow.
The motes arranged and rearranged themselves, forming not letters, but impressions. A river, a child laughing, a man in the water with hands outstretched. Paul was struck by the way the images avoided literal explanation and moved toward feeling. He was given the impression of a life lived, baptism in a Jordan-like place, a crowd listening on a hillside, a meal with hands and bread. He recognized the story of Jesus without being told the narrative by name. In time, he would recall how exact and how spare the being's images were, never substituting spectacle for detail, never attempting to replace scripture with showmanship. The images felt like keys you fit into a lock. They allowed certain parts of Paul's understanding to click open. The being did not say, "This proves X." It offered, with quiet insistence, another lens. "Consider the one you call Jesus," the transmission said. "He taught of a kingdom within. He moved as one who had learned to tune his heart. That tuning is possible for all of you." The phrase lodged. Paul's memory supplied the reference. "The kingdom of God is within you." He had quoted the line enough times from Luke to fill hymnals. Sitting alone now beneath the stained glass, the quotation lost its rhetorical comfort and became a challenge. The being's framing did not deny the uniqueness of Jesus. It reframed his life as an exemplar of a capacity that could be cultivated, not as a monopoly to be guarded. Paul felt his instincts tighten. The doctrine of substitutionary atonement, the comfort given by the idea that someone else had taken the debt on our behalf, these were not minor things. They had comforted people, healed families of guilt, formed the marrow of sermons. To suggest that Christ's life also pointed to a capacity within humanity was not necessarily heretical, but it threatened to break a neat theological machinery that had long given things order. He remembered his seminary professor's warnings. Be careful of spiritual experiences that rearrange doctrine, as if doctrine were paper to be folded. Paul felt the tug of that caution like a rope around his chest. The being anticipated the tightening. It did not press. Instead, it offered another image, a chorus of faces, not a single Savior, but many faces alight with that same centralizing glow, as if within each brow there had been struck a lamp. The image was not universalist in the way some modern platitudes are. It did not diminish the peculiarities of belief or ritual. It simply proposed that something Jesus embodied could be ignited within the human heart. Paul's resistance was not purely intellectual. He had presided over funerals where families had clung to the language of future consolation. He had watched people whisper the names of loved ones like rosary beads. The thought of suggesting to them that the true return of Christ might be a spark within people, rather than a cosmic event that reorganized reality externally, felt like betrayal.
He imagined the knives that would come from pulpit committees and denominational boards. He imagined letters of complaint and quieter losses, parishioners who would leave and never look back. Yet the being did not demand doctrinal capitulation. It spoke of frequencies and tuning, of inner states that manifested outwardly. There is resonance, it transmitted. Resonance aligns. Where resonance concentrates, transformation occurs. When the being used the language of frequency,
Paul bristled at first. These were words of a more modern spiritual idiom than the pulpit afforded. He had stood on stages and heard leaders speak the language of spiritual warfare and metaphysical victories. He preferred not to flatten theology into buzzwords. But the imagery the being offered was more than jargon. Paul could feel the idea of tuning. He pictured a choir where one voice was flat and the others balanced it into harmony. He saw how one person's panic could be soothed by another's steady breathing. Was it impossible that a posture of being could propagate like a sound? The image made the hairs on his forearm lift. It was then the being placed another memory before him, an image of a man on a cross, but not only as suffering. Paul felt the sorrow of that sight, the cruelty of the nails, the abandonment, and the depth of human betrayal and pain. He felt again the old gravity of that story. The being did not trivialize the cross. It expanded the frame and asked Paul to hold both, the uniqueness of a salvific act and the broader possibility that the pattern found in that life could be practiced and multiplied. Do not mistake multiplicity for diminution, the voice cautioned. Exemplars do not decrease in power as their example is followed. They enlarge its capacity. The images washed over him until he could do nothing but sit on the edge of the pulpit and breathe. He had come to the church seeking a sense of belonging after Martha's death. He had not expected initiation into such a profound reworking of his theology. The being's presence was not malevolent. It was an interrogator of the heart, a mentor in a language Paul had not trained to speak. He felt simultaneously the terror of heresy and the intoxication of insight. In the back of the sanctuary, a single candle in a votive box flickered as if responding to a wind only it could feel. Paul's rational mind tried to catalog the experience in the language of seminary and skepticism. He thought of St. Paul, who wrote of seeing things not to be spoken. He thought of prophets who had visions and were sometimes called mad. He felt the temptation to place this occurrence in a category and be done with it, yet dismissal felt cheap. The images had substance. The wound they probed was his grief, and the answer they offered was not easy. It required him to revise how he lived his faith, not only what he taught on Sunday. "Why show me this?" he asked inwardly, as much to steady himself as to collect information.
"You have been a keeper of words," the being replied in a tone of recognition. "You have shepherded doctrine, comforted sinners, resisted despair. Yet you hollow within at the thought that everything you carried might be a brittle thing. We offer a way for doctrine to meet practice, frequency to meet form. How you habitually align your inner state changes the world you touch." The notion that inner states translated to outer realities was not new. Paul had long believed that the heart was the wellspring of action. But the being gave the idea a different texture, light as a field that could be tuned, a kind of consciousness that spread when properly aligned. It was metaphor and instruction mingled. Paul listened because there was an urgency in the voice that was not instruction alone, but entreaty. He felt less like a subject of study than like a steward being asked to tend something fragile. At one point, the light forms gathered into a symbol at the center of the nave, a circle enclosing a smaller point, as if a sun focused on a seed. The symbol was neither wholly Christian nor alien, but in the hush of the sanctuary it suggested an axis. Paul experienced it as a promise and a warning in the same breath. The being then indicated that it would prove its sincerity. It did not offer laboratory evidence. It gave Paul a memory that was not his own, or perhaps it was, a place of coral light and a sky like blue glass, where beings like itself moved with an economy that was not hurried. Paul could tell the scene was not Earth because certain angles of light shifted in ways that made his eye ache gently. There were forms of architecture that resembled stacked shells in towers, and living things seemed to communicate by shifting the color in their surfaces rather than using sound. He saw a council, distant, impersonal, afflicted with concern for what they called a project. He did not see faces so much as patterns of attention. "The project is your emergence," the being transmitted. "You are not an afterthought in the cosmos. You are a possibility. Some have tried to shepherd your species. Some have watched. We are one such watcher. We do not take over. We amplify." The language leaned towards stewardship, not conquest. The being spoke of the human experiment as fragile, as a nascent field of potential that had both shadow and harvest. Paul felt the claim like a prickle of conscience and pride at once. If true, his species was more significant than his parochial theology had granted it, and yet more vulnerable. The idea that there might be other intelligences who were invested in human flourishing unsettled his worldview. It also, strangely, consoled him to think that Martha's fear might have been a human-level panic rather than a cosmic verdict. Paul tried again to find firm ground.
If what you say is true, he thought, then why come to me? Why a pastor who has lost faith in certain words? The answer when it came felt intimate.
"We choose those who will carry the message with both humility and breach," the being said. "You are known for your patience and for a reluctance to perform joy that is not felt. You will not be a billboard." The being's phrase, reluctance to perform joy, struck him hard. He had performed joy on pulpit Sundays. He had smiled at receptions and given old-fashioned pep talks. But he had not performed it as artifice. He had performed it because he knew the role of joy in sustaining others. The being's recognition of his interior was a mirror that made him suddenly visible in a way he had not expected. There was a moment of bargaining, not unlike the bargaining one sees at the bedside in hospice. Paul asked for a sign that could be shared. Make a photograph, leave a mark on a pew, provide a way for him to return to his congregation with an irrefutable token. The being refused, not with contempt but with explanation. "Tokens harden the heart into curiosity," it said. "They feed the part of you that would build altars to the object instead of learning to keep vigil at the altar of practice. We give you what changes your practice." It would have been easy to read the response as evasive. Paul sat with the sting of disappointment. A visible sign would have made the path safer. It would have eased the pastoral load. Instead, the being insisted on alteration of inner life. To his surprise, part of Paul felt relieved. He had always suspected that theurgy and sign-chasing were glossier than substance. Yet he was a man who had stood in front of congregations, and congregations pay attention to visible things. For a while, the meeting in the sanctuary held like a suspended instrument. The being's transmissions came as images and as urges, to pray not as an invocation, but as a calibration, to live gratitude as a practice that modifies nervous systems and therefore communities, to teach in ways that invited people to experience a peace rather than only to assent to creeds. There was woven in these transmissions a moral insistence. Alignment carries responsibility. Those who attuned their air states could not then walk away and pretend no one else's weather would change. Paul felt the old moral machinery in his chest, the sense that saving souls is work that requires care for doctrine, shift into a more complicated device that required sensitivity to habit, to ritual, and to the slow patience of change. The being's message, if he would let it, asked him to change not merely words but rhythms. "How," he asked, "do I begin?" "Begin in contact," the being said. The word contact had a double edge. It was both literal and theological here. Begin by slowing the mechanisms that make haste into habit. Teach people to listen to the body. Teach them to find the still point in small practices. Invite them into the inner room where the kingdom sits. This will not always look like revival. It will often be small, a steadying breath, a meal shared without hurry, an apology uttered in the presence of shame. These are the frequencies that repair. Paul took this in as if it were counsel from an old mentor. He felt simultaneously humbled and terrified. The idea of reorienting his ministry from proclamation to formation was both what he sensed he needed and what would break him financially, politically, relationally. He pictured church boards and donors, and the precariousness of any new path took a tally in his chest. Yet alongside the tally sat another image, Martha's thin hand, a small lamp of life that for a moment had seemed to struggle and then flare. Night weight pressed on the chapel windows. Outside the sanctuary, the parking lot lamp hummed faintly. The being's presence did not feel endless. Its attention had the cadence of visit, deep, concentrated, then moved on. In one of the last transmissions of that first meeting, it used a word Paul had not expected. Return, it said, not as a rival of an object, but as awakening. The return of what you call Christ is the spread of resonance. The phrase was a literal translation of the title he had preached for decades, The Return. He had always imagined it as trumpet sound and wind that rearranged the earth. Now the being suggested the return was more like a tide of inner awakening that, when it rose high enough, rewrites the contours of human communities. Paul felt the theological ground shift beneath his feet. The scaffolding, the tidy, comforting maps still stood.
This was not an invitation to deny them. Rather, it was an insistence that something else be added, practice that shapes inner frequency. He felt the conflict like a pressure in his throat, loyalty to the old language and the pull toward the new. When the being paused, the sanctuary returned to its familiar acoustics, a soft hum of the heater, the tiny creak of settling wood. Paul's heartbeat calmed into a rhythm he recognized. He was, in some sense, still within his life, the hymnals on the shelf, the kneeler worn smooth, the baptismal font. Whatever had happened in the space of that hour had been intimate, but it had not felt arbitrary. He had not been abducted into a spectacle. He had been engaged in a conversation that rearranged the furniture of his faith. As he walked back through the narrow hallway toward the door, collecting his coat like armor, the being transmitted one more image, a sky shot through with unfamiliar constellations, and a name, Zeta Reticuli, landed in his mind with the odd tang of cosmic geography. The being used the name as if it were a place where watchers gathered. Paul filed it away not as verification, but as an offering, a breadcrumb that might make the tale plausible to some and unbelievable to others. He did not yet understand whether that name mattered. What mattered was the interior cost of the evidence the being had placed before him.
He stepped into the cold and felt the world, for the first time in many months, as if it might be listened to differently. The lamp above him made his shadow long across the asphalt. The figure had retreated to the darker edge of the lot. When he turned to look, the being's outline dissolved into the night like breath in winter. On the drive home, his hands trembled on the wheel. He told himself that he had been touched by a revelation that would require quiet attention. He rehearsed phrases in his head, words he might use should he dare to bring what happened to anyone. I experienced a visitation. I had a vision. I was shown. None felt adequate. The language of the pulpit, with its cadence and centuries, sagged under the burden of the fresh images in his mind. He feared the language would either domesticate the experience into something the congregation expected, or make him sound like a charlatan. Jennifer called as he pulled into the driveway. His daughter's voice, threaded through the phone, was the ordinary world. She had become the other anchor in his life after Martha. Her tone was practical and edged with concern. She had come out from the city for the funeral and stayed longer than planned, a steadying presence when the church calendar would have otherwise swallowed the silence. "Dad," she asked, "you okay? You sounded different on the voicemail. You're home late." He thought of the being's characteristics: patient attention, invitation, a refusal to offer tokens. He weighed the cost of telling her immediately. To tell Jennifer would mean exposing his frailties and the rawness of his grief again, but perhaps also to share the one person whose steadiness was able to handle it. "I'm all right," he said finally. The words were not a lie. They were a truth in the sense that a man can be intact and altered at the same time. "I spent some time in the church. I saw something." "Dad," she said, the protective daughter resurfacing, "if you're feeling like you did after the funeral, call me. I can come over." He listened to the familiar refrain of care, and unbidden, the being's earlier counsel returned. Begin in practice. Invite people into inner rooms. He imagined Jennifer as the first small experiment, not an audience, but a partner. He promised nothing. He asked only that she come by the next morning for coffee and a walk. She agreed. That night, alone in bed, Paul stared at the ceiling. The sanctuary's images remained like phosphorescence. He could hear Martha's quiet breathing in memory, and the way she had once hummed an old hymn in the kitchen as if to fill the house with ordinariness. He thought of the being's description of watchers and stewards, and felt like a diver who has seen something luminous under the waves, both compelled to return and frightened of saying the thing aloud. He had been taken, if taken could mean led into an interior exposition, and he had been gifted with a new hermeneutic. But the hermeneutic demanded changes in his life that would ripple outward unpredictably. As sleep finally took him, it brought not rest, but a residue of imagery, the counsel in choral light, a symbol like a seed, the faint, persistent memory of Martha's lamp. He knew in the slow furnace of his being that the morning would demand decisions. He did not yet know which ones were his to make, and which were meant for the people he served. What he did know was that after decades of shepherding others through certainty and doubt, he had been given a sight that made both seem smaller and larger at once. When he woke, the sky outside his window was thin with pre-dawn gray. The street was quiet, and the ordinary noises of the neighborhood, a dog, a truck, a neighbor's morning radio,
felt like a choir in the key of reality. He dressed slowly, as if clothing might armor him for a new vocation. He made coffee without measuring and pressed the ceramic mug between his palms to feel the warmth. It steadied him. There would be time, he thought, to decide what to say, to whom, and how. For now, the matter at hand was private and unadorned, to be present in the ways the being had suggested. He would take his daughter for a walk, practice the simple exercises the being had named, begin to notice the small calibrations of attention and breath. He would not plaster the story across every bulletin board. He would perhaps write down what he remembered in careful, unbelieving detail and tuck the note away. The being's prohibition on tokens had been practical and wise. He would not seek proof in objects. He would search for it in people. He left the house and walked toward the church at the edge of dawn, a man who had been invited to hold a paradox. The neighborhood was waking in small ways, a newspaper plopping on a porch, the metallic bark of a neighbor's dog. The church's silhouette, when he saw it again, had a different thickness to it, as if it were a vessel that now contained both grief and possibility. He felt simultaneously like a man chosen and like a man who had simply been paying attention at the right time. He had not yet told anyone the details that weighed on him. He would need words delicate enough to carry the experience without crushing the cargo of those who would hear it. He would need courage to stand in front of a congregation and name the direction he felt urged to take without betraying the ones he loved or the doctrine that had shaped him. He needed, as the being had said, to begin in practice, to find the small places where inner alignment made the world softer. At the church door he paused and put his hand to the wood. It was cool, textured with a century of finger marks. He felt the presence again, not in the air, but like a memory of a hand upon his shoulder. The being had promised no shortcuts. It had spoken not as a conqueror, but as a guide. Then, as he turned to enter, the sky above the steeple, already thinly brightening, flashed.
Not lightning, but a brief, intense bloom of light that sent his heart thudding. For an instant, the air seemed to vibrate with a high, small tone that he could feel behind his teeth. He came alive, and also afraid. Inside the sanctuary, a new image awaited him. This one larger, more expansive than the small mosaics the being had first shown. It spread like a map. Paul felt, rather than saw, an orientation to a place not only of memory, but of possibility, a sequence that promised to explain more than it had so far. His breath caught. He reached without thinking, like a man trying to steady a boat. He did not yet know what lay beyond that image. He knew only that if he followed it, there would be costs and joy both, that he would be changed in ways his old sermons could not account for, and that, whether other people accepted what he would have to tell them or not, his life had been altered by what he had been shown. Paul stepped forward into the light, toward an answer that would not be easy to speak and might not be welcomed, but which felt, in the raw marrow of the morning, like the only truthful next step. He walked into the bloom of light because, after a night of being shown images and given counsel, there was no mechanical logic that offered a better course. Either the world had tilted and he would live with that tilt, or he would go back to the old steady place and pretend the tilt had never happened. The lamp above him hummed once more like a tuning fork, and the ground under his shoes shivered with a familiarity he could not name. Then the light closed around him, not as a trap, but as a kind of carriage, and for a sliver of time he felt less like a man swept off his feet than like someone being invited to cross a threshold he had only ever described in sermons. What followed was not the Hollywood rush of being yanked into a ship that smelled of ozone and humming metal. Paul's memory held it instead as a series of nested experiences, an elongation of time in which texture and tone mattered more than mechanics. The sanctuary's rafters seemed to drop away like a peeled curtain. For a moment he thought he was still in the church, only more honest. The smell of burned candles intensified, the echo of his own breath magnified into a chorus. Then, as quickly as a page being turned, he stood in a place that was simultaneously near and impossibly far. He found himself in a circular chamber that resembled, in its primary impression, a library of light. Surfaces were not painted but tuned. They shifted in hue when he blinked. There were beings present, several, arrayed like scholars around a round table, though their bodies refused the prison of human description. They had surfaces that shimmered with internal geometry, eyes, or their equivalent, folding attention inward, then outward again. Paul noticed with the peculiar calm of someone taking notes inside a dream that none of them wore expressions that signaled triumph.
Instead, there was concentration, a petal-thin sadness, and an attention that felt like a hand holding a young animal. One of them, if one could use that term, stepped closer. Paul felt the same voice in his skull, but now threaded with textures that suggested a collective intelligence rather than a solitary pulse. The being's transmission was an image first, a sphere, slightly larger than a grapefruit, rotating in space. Inside the sphere were shifting layers, temperaments, histories, potentialities, each folding into the next. The being presented the sphere with something like reverence. "This is you," it said, and Paul felt the pronoun land awkwardly in his chest. This planet's emergent frequency contains rooms of possibility. We watch those rooms. We support vectors of emergence when we can. We have watched the pattern that you name Jesus. We saw how that pattern echoed an attainable form. The phrase, "we support vectors of emergence," threaded between Paul's theological instincts and the images the being had already offered. A man who lived at a particular pitch of compassion, a rippling consequence of practice, the idea of a life tuned so precisely it became transmissible. Paul's training wanted to reject the vocabulary, vector, emergent frequency, as the language of an alien technocracy. Yet there was a humility in the way the beings spoke. They said they watched, they said they amplified, they said they did not dominate. A second image arrived, clearer this time, not as a fragment but as a sequence. He saw a lake of glass under a sky that spun with new constellations. He saw people gathered in a way that knew how to be still together. He saw hands reaching across differences without the posture of conquering. Paul felt that the vision was less about the machinery of a craft and more about a grammar of attention. The beings did not force a law but suggested a practice. "Why us?" Paul asked aloud, because the question wanted the dignity of being spoken. "Why come now? Why show me these things?" The being transmitted a memory, if memory was the right word, of a council place where attention was distributed like sunlight. They had been watching a long span of human movements, art, cruelty, love, invention. What they called the project, the attempt to shepherd what they called human emergence, had been filled with experiments both gentle and sharp. Sometimes they intervened subtly, a small nudge in a dream, an impression planted in a leader, an adjustment of resonance in a group that then altered the way they met despair. They compared their interventions to a gardener pruning shoots, never to force a bloom but to encourage a tendency that was already seeded. "You have been chosen," the being said, "not for authority but for stewardship. The one you call Christ left a pattern. Patterns can be followed. Patterns can be taught. This is not erasure. It is continuation." There was a gravity to the word chosen that pricked Paul's old nerves.
He had been chosen countless times within his life, ordained, entrusted, called. Those words had weight that led to committees and bills and a lifetime of unglamorous duties. Yet here the word was lighter, a gasp more than a title, someone asked to hold and pass on a way of tending spirit. The council, if that was what these assemblers of attention were, showed him something else then, the life of Jesus not as a dossier of miracles to be proven or disproven, but as an exemplar of attention. It was not an attempt to diminish theology, it was an attempt to enlarge category. Paul experienced the baptism in terms of immersion into alignment. He felt the healing touch as a frequency matched rather than an incantation performed. The crucifixion remained a horizon of pain and forgiveness, but the being invited him to also see the life as practice, a sustained cultivation of a certain coherence in the heart. Paul bristled at the edges. Seminars and pew warriors would call this a demotion of grace into practice, he thought. But the being gently clarified, there is no binary. The saving event need not be collapsed into technique. What you call grace is a field into which practice can open more doors. The life you call Christ shows the topology of that opening. Every sentence from these watchers arrived with an intimation that they were describing as Paul's grandson might describe how to strike the right chord on a piano. They could not substitute for the musician, they could not capture the human soul, but they offered parameters,
breath, attention, the communal sustaining of a posture. Then, as if to prove they did not only speak in abstractions, a sequence of images like proof arrived. Paul saw a woman in a noisy emergency room steady a panicked child by aligning her breath to the child's. The light in him, no bigger than a candle, took on steadier flame. He saw a reformatory where a guard learned to listen rather than punish. Violence ebbed. He saw a small town where neighbors learned the practice of grief-sharing in a circle. Their civic life softened. None of these were spectacle. They were modest, almost invisible shifts. But in their accumulation, they made new weather. "We do not command miracles," the being said. "We show the architecture of resonance, and when enough practice concentrates, communities shift. This is what you may call return, not an object arriving, but a critical mass of inner work." Paul sat with that phrase, critical mass of inner work, and the pastor in him catalogued the theological implications. The doctrines of substitution, of accounts settled, of future vindication. All those words that soothed coffins and steadied congregational hands were not being dismissed. Instead, they were being offered a companion. If a person believed in substitution, if that belief gave them courage in life, could they also practice attunement?
Could the experience of being forgiven be married to a daily discipline that altered how one met strangers? The being's answer was not brute, it was practical. "You will return," it said, "with questions. We do not ask you to renounce, we ask you to teach different muscles." There was a temptation then to demand a sign, the profession of a parish caster who knew how much a congregation needed tangible proof. Paul had asked for tokens before. He had learned the seduction of them. He now understood the being's earlier refusal. Proof that hardened into idolatry would be proof that masked practice. He had enough funerals behind him to know that people can worship a relic and miss the love that made the relic holy. Instead, the beings offered examples, and then they offered a method. They described not as a production manual, but as a practice, a set of simple actions one could incorporate into daily life. Begin with breath, they urged. Teach the body how to find stillness for 60 seconds. Teach gratitude as a muscle, 3 details per morning. Teach apology as a practice in language, not as a sermon about sin. Invite people into the inner room where the heart can be tuned. Each small practice is a frequency. Together they amplify. Paul heard, almost as if it had been his own thought put forward, the pastoral wisdom he had always valued. Do not ask people to do what you will not do yourself. The being's insistence that he must begin in practice was not humiliation, it was a requirement of credibility. He could not, if he was to keep his integrity, preach inner tuning from a pedestal without living it in the parish hall and let the consequences ripple. Then came the most difficult thing. The being placed before him a choice rendered in moral and social texture. If Paul became a steward of this way, he would alter worship, shift sermon content, and ask people to adopt practices that might feel at first like betrayals of the old certainties. The community would fragment. Some would stay, some would leave. The denomination might hear and write cautionary letters. Donations might dwindle. His daughter Jennifer might worry he had wrecked his credibility. The being did not promise ease. "You will be tested," it said. "Where you seek reward only in numbers, you will struggle. Where you hold loyalty to both word and practice, you will be a bridge. Every steward must choose the shape of his fidelity." Paul felt the old pastoral calculus. Numbers save buildings, programs stabilize budgets, reputation secures survival. To accept the invitation would be to accept losses that had no guarantee of a harvest. Yet he felt the call like a bone-deep thing in him. He had been a man of words, now he was asked to be a man of rhythms. The council gave him one last transmission before the light released him back into the church's hush.
It was a memory. Whether theirs or a joint anthology of possibilities was not for him to decide. Of a future in which a small street in a city was known for a practice of sitting with the grieving until grief learned less to howl and more to breathe. People would say in that future that the city had changed not because the sky fell open, but because the citizens learned the small art of alignment. "We have watched such cities bloom," the being said. "We offer amplification. We are not saviors. You are." When he opened his eyes, he was once again under the ordinary glow of the sanctuary's emergency lights. The votive candle in the back guttered and steadied as if nothing extraordinary had visited. The sound of the heater resumed its domestic complaints. Paul felt, as if in agreement with the world, that the visitation had been both intimate and impossible to enclose in language. He had been abducted, if the word fit a transport into a council room of attention, and he had been taught, if the word fit one who learns to play an instrument. He walked out into the morning air with his hunger sharpened not for spectacle, but for practice.
The lamp that had later dissolved in the lot now felt like a friend who had come to say a few consequential things and then leave. For the rest of that day he moved as if his limbs had learned a new metric. Breath first, sentence second. Notice the other's face. Slow the urge to fix. Allow the question to carry you rather than leaning to answer it. He called Jennifer, and when she arrived for their walk, he did not launch into the whole of it. He had learned in the early hush of the encounter that raw revelation needs a frame. He told her a modest portion, that he had been shown things, that he had been invited to change practices, that he felt compelled to try. Jennifer listened like a daughter who has learned to hold her father's confidences with grace. She asked practical questions, pragmatic and tender. "Will you talk about it in church?" she asked finally. Paul thought of the pulpit and how it had often asked for gestures contained in neat doctrines. He thought of the being's insistence that tokens are seductive and shallow. "Not in the way you might expect," he said. "Not with proofs. I want to teach practices first. If people want to hear about the experience that led me here, I will tell them in time, but I will start small." She took his arm as they walked. The neighborhood had not yet fully waked. Their conversation drifted into pointers. "Breathe with me. Say 3 things you're grateful for. Notice the neighbor's window." She humored him, as daughters do, when fathers rediscover wonder. Paul did not mind. He needed a place to practice. In the weeks that followed, he experimented in ways that were humble and unadvertised.
He rewrote a midweek gathering into what he called a stillness circle, 10 minutes of guided breath, a brief invitation to notice a moment of gratitude, then conversation about keeping watch in ordinary life. He taught parishioners a simple practice: lay your hand over your heart for 60 seconds each morning and name 3 things you are grateful for. Hold an intention to be present to someone in need that day. He introduced a short liturgy of apology. Each week, 1 or 2 people volunteered to speak a small regret out loud, not as confession to be adjudicated, but as a practice of repair, and others answered with a simple, practiced phrase of recognition rather than judgment. The changes were not theatrical. Older members grumbled at the coffee hour. Some said they had come to hear preaching about the resurrection, not breathwork. The deacon board called a meeting in which they asked for clarity and reasserted budgets. A donor threatened to divert funds to another church. A few family members left, some because they were uncomfortable with what felt like novelty, others because change makes faith feel unsafe. The parish's newsletter for a month became an anxious place. But something else happened that the committees did not predict. A small group of people who had worn faith like a brittle armor began to loosen. A woman who had stopped coming to church after a divorce found that the invitation to sit in silence, to be heard without a sermon about the ethics of sin, felt like a doorway back. A young man learned to name his anger in the apologetic practice and saw the edge of it dull. The hospice volunteers reported that the parishioners who practiced the breathwork seemed steadier in hospital rooms. These were not arena-moving miracles. They were a quiet rearrangement of conduct. Paul altered his sermons too, but with restraint. He kept the doctrines that shaped him, incarnation, atonement, resurrection, as core metaphors that had kept people from drowning. Yet he began to weave practice into narrative. A sermon on the parable of the sower, for example, shifted from an exposition of election to a lesson on gardening. What soil do we cultivate internally? How do practices of attention create soil where seeds can take root? He quoted scripture sparingly and then asked the congregation to do a brief practice that made the theological claim bodily. A minute of listening to the breath, and then a moment of naming the person you would check on this week. Reactions were mixed. A local radio host read an excerpt of one of his sermons and suggested Paul had gone off the rails. An old friend in the denomination wrote a worried letter about theological drift. A journalist called, then hung up when the conversation got too slow for their preferred sound bites. The internet did what it does. Someone posted a clipped video of Paul describing return as inner awakening, and the clip circulated with commentary that ranged from admiring to vituperative.
Paul slept less sleepfully and more deliberately. He learned to answer the easier questions with a gentleness that sometimes irritated those who wanted his mind. "Are you saying Jesus wasn't unique?" he would be asked. "Nothing of the sort," he answered. "Ununiqueness and practice are not opposed. I'm saying his life can be read as a map. How we read it is important. My reading is one of many. It is a witness, not a treaty." The careful qualifiers were not gestures of cowardice. They were a way to honor the parish's need for safe language, even as he brought them to the edge of new practice. Jennifer watched him with a mixture of patience and concern.
She endured awkward coffee hour conversations. She sat in the back of the sanctuary the day he described the practice of apology as a liturgy and felt the congregation breathe in guilt and finally out. He did not in public claim any cosmic credential. He described the visitation as his interior experience, his revelation, not a universal edit of doctrine. That distinction mattered. It kept the door open for those who might disagree. One night, months into the change, a young man came to Paul after the stillness circle. He had been on the brink of leaving the city. He had been terrified of his anger, had been sleeping poorly, and had been about to give up. "I don't know what you did," the man said, voice thin, "but I can sleep now. I can look at my brother without burning." It was the kind of feedback that does not appear in board reports, but measures better than budgets, the shifting of a life's weather. Soon the ripple extended beyond the parish. A neighboring congregation invited Paul to speak, not on his experience, but on practice. He traveled with the humility of a man who had been taught in private. He led small groups in a sequence of practices the being had described: breath, gratitude, apology, and service tending, practical acts that allowed the inner attunement to bear on the world's needs. There were still letters of complaint. There were still conversations about orthodoxy, but there were also communities that began to borrow elements, adapt them to their own creeds, and call the adaptation by other names. The being's watchers, for their part, seemed to remain absent in the glare of headlines. Paul often wondered whether they had a particular indirectness by design, to seed rather than to seedlessly harvest. Once, late in the spring, he thought he saw a light far over the tree line at night that made him recall the name Zeta Reticuli. He did not publish it. He mentioned it to Jennifer over the washing of dishes. "It's not proof," he said. "It's a breadcrumb in my mind." She nodded without needing drama. The theological friction did not cease. At a presbytery meeting, a colleague admonished him publicly, "Faith must hold to received truth." Paul answered, as he now habitually did, "Received truth has carried us through disasters. I honor it deeply."
I'm trying to teach practices that allow people to live those truths. I'm not offering a replacement. His tone was steady. His voice bore the record of months of practice in his chest. He did not need to be right in every argument. He needed to be faithful to the work that held him. Guilt, too, came in seasons. He never stopped wondering whether the being had been right to show him Martha's fear in that particular way. That memory had been a mirror that amputated his complacency. He imagined, occasionally with a sharpness that made prayer hard, what might have happened if he had been more present in the hospice ward. But the being had not shown him a place of blame so much as a place of responsibility. Grief was fuel if burned alone, but it could be changed into attentive practice when held and processed with others. At Christmas, when the sanctuary filled with the familiar lights and the smell of orange peel and cloves, Paul spoke of the Nativity in a way that felt both new and old. He spoke of the manger's humility as an image of the inner room, small, managed, sustained. He spoke of Mary's yes as an alignment. He did not rail against tradition. He offered an invitation. Afterwards, a woman approached, took his hand, and said simply, "You helped me forgive my father today. That's all I wanted." He left the church that night with a folded note in his pocket, a gratitude for practice, and he thought how small the ticker of life's change often was. Outside of the parish, conversations began to take on a different texture in the wider neighborhood. A coffee shop that had hosted his stillness circle reprinted his simple practices on a laminated card for patrons. A community center invited him to teach volunteers how to be bedside steady. The local hospice asked him to lead a short training in presence. None of these were dramatic shifts in the global order, but they knitted a fabric that resisted despair. The watchers maybe wanted fabric more than a flag. There were moments when the old world intruded hard. A radio host frothed and claimed that Paul had been brainwashed by space evangelists. An email accusing him of heresy arrived. Yet the hits of media attention were shallow. People's lives were not. Small, stubbornly ordinary acts continued to count. A teenager's apology to a father, a person who chose to sit with a dying neighbor instead of scrolling, a pastor who finally admitted he was lost in a room full of people and asked for help. In 2 years, those small acts made uneven but visible differences in the municipal hospital's volunteer program. Grief counseling saw increased attendance. A community garden began. Paul continued to have questions, of course. He had not received encyclopedic answers. The being's transmissions were not a doctrinal treatise, but an initiation into practice. He sometimes suspected that the watchers preferred a kind of open-source conversion. No final lines, only invitations.
He found that this ambiguity was less an insult than a gift. People were forced to come to their own interior rooms and to practice.
Late one evening, after a particularly charged board meeting that nearly dissolved the church's youth program, Paul stood on the small hill beside the steeple and watched the sky. It was a clean, cold night. The stars pricked. Without advertisement or fanfare, a thin light passed above, slowly, then sped and disappeared in a blink. He did not know if this was a craft or an aircraft or a trick of his own mind. He had come to accept that some things would remain ambiguous. The important part, he had learned in the months of leading practice, was how he responded when ambiguity appeared, with curiosity and fidelity, rather than fear and dogmatism. He had another worry, sharper, the risk that a movement could substitute novelty for depth. He had seen charismatic movements come and go in his decades of ministry, leaving behind a flotsam of disappointed people. To guard against that, he insisted on pedagogy, teaching people to return to the breath, to gratitude, to apology, not as a trend, but as a craft. He wrote brief, careful guides, 5-minute practices for mourning, a week-long sequence for dealing with grief, a small liturgy for apology. He taught them in the parish hall, but he also gave them away in the neighborhood bake shop with an apologetic smile. He wanted the work to be sturdy. Over time, the parish stabilized into a new rhythm. Some long-term members never returned. Some stayed and, visibly moved by the practices, apologized in the weekly liturgy and found a steadier life. New people came, people who had arrived hungry for something that shaped their lives without promising spectacular signs. The youth program reoriented to include mindfulness and service. He remained in many ways the pastor he had always been, present at funerals, sitting with the confused, insisting on the dignity of probate meetings. He had only expanded the repertoire. On the anniversary of Martha's death, he climbed the steps to the hospice ward where she had lain and lit a candle with the nurse. He placed his hand over his heart and named 3 things he was grateful for about her life aloud, then bowed his head. The gesture was private, small, and felt like a covenant. People began to tell their stories. In the months following, a pattern emerged. Those who practiced found a way to bear the unbearable. They did not necessarily become saints. They became steadier humans. The change was not always neat. There were flare-ups of anger, reversion, and old habits. Yet there was a thread. A tension sown habitually produced differences. Paul's story, when it reached ears beyond the town, was often summed by headlines into the sensational. Retired pastor abducted by aliens reveals truth. He disliked the reduction, the way the subtext of practice and slow pedagogy could be collapsed into spectacle.
He did not deny the visitation in his life, but he also insisted in interviews, careful, slow interviews with journalists who would listen, that the beings had not given a blueprint for conquest or a cosmic guarantee. What was offered me, he would say, was an invitation to a life. It required work. It was not a stage trick. It asked for patience. There were, even years later, skeptics who wrote academic articles suggesting cases of shared dreaming or neurological anomalies. There were also theologians who wrote thoughtful critiques about the risks of spiritual overreach. Paul read them as if they were letters, some accusing, some solicitous, and thanked God for the oxygen of critique. He wanted his work to be tested, not to be immune. He had become a man who welcomed hard questions because they kept the practice honest. One clear evening in late summer, he stood again beneath a sky that seemed broader than his life. The church lawn smelled of mown grass. The congregation had organized a small outdoor evening of listening and sharing, a picnic where people practiced gratitude aloud and then sat in silence for a while. A small crowd gathered, older and younger faces braided together. For a time there was only the processing of breath, the slow sound of people learning a new habit. When he rose to speak, he did not announce cosmic evidence or claim exclusive insight. He told them, in a voice that had sharpened into a kind of gentle insistence, that the way of Jesus could be read as an invitation to care for one another at the frequency level, practices that could transform the microclimates of neighborhoods. He told a brief story of a woman who found the courage to reconcile with her son, and whose life, when steadied, influenced a ward in the hospital. He did not ask them to accept the visitation as binding for all. He asked them to try the practices, to see if their breath steadied and their meetings became less combative. At the end of the evening, an elderly man, the sort of person who had been in the church for more than 50 years and had no patience for novelty, walked up and pressed his palm into Paul's arm.
"I don't know what to make of the stars," the man said, voice weary with weather. "But when my wife died and I sat here doing that breathing," he wiped his eye, "my rage went down for the first time in decades." He laughed like a man rediscovering an old mercy. "So," he said, "maybe the world is more complicated than my sermons taught me." Paul could only hold the man's hand and nod. Complexity had been the gift of the visitation. It had given him a truth complicated enough to make room for the old certainties and new practices. In the hush afterward, people lingered, shifting from talk to the ordinary business of returning home. He watched them go, the way you watch a tide recede, and then wonder what has been left on the beach.
In private moments, he sometimes wrestled with the ontology of the being's claim, zeta reticuli, watchers, councils, and he always folded his uncertainties into prayer. He continued to pray in words inherited from the church, and he practiced gratitude in the ways the being had shown. The two lives, ancient liturgy and new practice, began to nestle together like two hands cupped around a small, warming stone. Years later, when the first rumor of a growing network of small communities tuning their inner states began to swell into something noticeable, journalists called again. The phrase Christ consciousness had been adopted by some and adapted by many. Paul would say in interviews that the phrase was one way to translate an experience into contemporary vocabulary, but that it needed careful theological bedrock, that he did not mean to supplant doctrines, but to offer a practical complement. "Think of it as learning to be hospitable to the Spirit in your daily pulse," he would tell them. "Think of it as forming a muscle that can carry the weight of mercy." He never lost the sense that the watchers' involvement had been measured. They amplified, they nudged, and then they receded. Whether they were extraterrestrial in a literal sense or an embodiment of something else, an emergent category of attention, was less important to him than the work that came after. He had been taken out of his ordinary life and shown a pedagogy. The cosmic language that accompanied it served as a narrative frame that helped some believe and made others uneasy. The essential thing was whether the practices taught could change the microclimate of care. Standing again one clear dawn at the foot of the steeple, as the first thin light threaded the windows, Paul remembered Martha's question. "What happens to us, Paul? Where do we go if the light isn't there?" He had no claim to a final answer as an abstract theorem, but he did have witnesses of changed lives, the slow pattern of practices that made people less likely to flee in the face of fear, and a congregation that had learned to be both cautious and generous. He had learned that the light was not a single object in the sky, but a state people could foster inside themselves and in one another. That insight did not erase doctrines, it reframed certain claims as invitations to practice. He thought as well of the watchers in their council rooms, their choral light assemblies that had not come in domination but in support. He no longer reduced his experience to the binaries that had once comforted him. Mystery remained. He had been called into it, questioned by it, instructed gently, and then returned to the long work of tending a people. Above, in the crease of dawn, he felt a thin, distant attention, an impression that the skies were not empty of care. He did not need confirmation. He had the parish, the practices, the people whose lives bent toward steadiness.
He had Martha's memory converted into a work of attention and a congregation that learned to inhabit small kindnesses. If the watchers were still watching, that was, for him, a consolation, but not proof. He walked back into the sanctuary and placed his hand on the cool wood of the door. He breathed 3 steady breaths, and then in the small room at the back where candles were lit for the departed, he wrote a brief note. A simple list of practices to share at the next gathering, a reminder to himself not to replace roots with spectacle. He folded the note and tucked it into his shirt like a talisman without magic. Outside, the sun rose over the steeple and painted the stained glass with something like benediction. The world did not rearrange in one trumpet sound, but in the leaves of the trees, in the faces at the picnic, in the hands that learned to steady grief with breath, something had shifted. The return, the being had said, might be a spreading resonance. Paul believed now that when enough humans learned to tune their inner lives towards compassion, when they learned to practice gratitude and apology and presence, the world's weather could change. If that sounded heretical to some, he accepted the charge. If it felt like continuity to others, he accepted fellowship. He had seen what he had seen in a night under a parking lamp, been taken into counsel, and returned with practices that slowly asked people to be better. Whether the watchers were aliens or metaphors for attentional architectures mattered less than the daily patient work of teaching people how to hold one another.
As people filtered into the morning service that day, some stayed for the small stillness circle that followed. Paul stood at the edge as they sat and breathed, and he felt the warmth of a life being formed. Small, insistently humble, and yet able, in time, to alter neighborhoods and hospitals and dinner tables. He did not promise wealth or universal health. He promised only that the practices could change the way people met each other, that they could turn fear into steadier company. When the service ended, someone asked if Paul would tell them the story, about the visit, the council, the word zeta reticuli. He paused. Then he said what he had said before, that he had been given an experience that pushed him into practice, that what followed mattered more than the origin story. If you want to hear more about what I experienced, he added, mild as a man holding a fragile truth, come learn the practices. Walk with us. Try the breath. Have patience. Outside, a young mother with a sleeping child in her arms glanced up at the sky, then back at him. She smiled. We'll try, she said. We'll try. Paul watched a moment longer as people scattered into the day, some hurried, some lingering, and he turned his face upward. The sky was a hard blue, and for a moment he thought he perceived the faintest, distant line of light where watchers might watch.
He did not know the boundaries of anything now with the certainty he once craved. He knew only that, for him, the truth that had been revealed in that night by a presence that moved not like a human, but like attention itself, was this: humanity's ultimate truth, as he had come to understand it, was not a secret code to be discovered in the stars, but a habit to be practiced in the heart. If enough people learned to tune love, to steady their breath, to repair harm, the return of what he called Christ might unfold, not as a single trumpet, but as 100,000 small acts of alignment that together made the world more habitable. Whether watchers from Zeta Reticuli shepherded that unfolding, or whether that was the language his mind reached for in a night of strain, he could not say. He would not claim it as an article of faith for all. He could only testify. He had been taken, he had learned, he had returned, and he had begun to teach. If this story stirred something in you, if you have had an experience that altered the shape of your own faith or attention, share it in the comments. Tell how a small practice changed the weather of your life. Subscribe to hear more eyewitness accounts of people who were changed and who, in turn, try to be instruments of steadying love. The watchers, if they watch, will have many more stories to tell beyond our words. Until then, we can do the slow work of tuning together.